Rebecca Torres was 29 years old when she bought the house that would change her life, though she didn't know it at the time. She was in her fourth year teaching second grade in Columbus, Ohio, earning $42,000 annually and watching her friends buy houses, get married, and build lives that seemed impossibly distant from her own reality. Rebecca lived in a studio apartment with a radiator that clanked all night and neighbors who fought loud enough to wake her at 3 in the morning. She had $17,000 in student loans, a car that needed a new transmission, and exactly $6,000 in savings. When her grandmother passed away and left her $5,000, Rebecca knew she should be responsible and pay down debt. Instead, she started looking at real estate listings in places most people had never heard of. The house was in Millfield, Ohio, a coal mining town in the Appalachian foothills where the population had dropped from 4,000 in 1950 to fewer than 400 today. The listing described it as a fixer-upper with historical charm, which was realtor code for barely standing. Built in 1923 by the coal company for a mine supervisor, the two-story Craftsman had been abandoned since 2003 when the last owner died without heirs. The property had gone through tax foreclosure and ended up with the county land bank, which was desperate to offload properties in towns where no one wanted to live anymore. The asking price was $5,000, and the listing warned potential buyers about structural issues, roof damage, and the likelihood of extensive water damage throughout. Rebecca drove down to Millfield on a Saturday in March when the trees were still bare and a cold drizzle made everything look bleaker than it probably was. The town consisted of a single intersection with a shuttered grocery store, a post office that opened 2 hours a day, and maybe 50 houses scattered along roads that wound through the hills. Her house sat on a dirt lane at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown forsythia bushes and what had once been a garden. The exterior was weathered gray clapboard siding with a front porch that sagged noticeably to the left. Several windows were broken and someone had spray-painted "Condemned" across the front door in faded orange letters. Inside was worse than Rebecca had imagined. The floor joists in the kitchen had rotted through, creating a dangerous pit where the linoleum had collapsed into the crawl space. The bathroom fixtures had been stripped by scavengers. Every room smelled of mold and animal urine. Wallpaper hung in long strips from the walls, revealing layers of older paper beneath. The second floor was inaccessible because the staircase had partially collapsed. Rebecca stood in what had been the living room, looking at a stone fireplace that appeared to be the only solid thing in the entire structure, and tried to convince herself this was a reasonable decision. She failed, but she made an offer anyway. $5,000. Her grandmother's entire bequest, for a house that should probably be demolished. The closing took place in a lawyer's office that doubled as a tax preparation service. Rebecca signed papers, handed over a cashier's check, and received a set of keys that looked like they hadn't been used in 20 years. She drove back to Columbus with a deed to property she couldn't afford to fix and couldn't afford to abandon. Her best friend told her she was insane. Her mother cried. Rebecca took a week off work during spring break and returned to Millfield with a sleeping bag, a camping stove, and a probably unrealistic plan to make at least one room livable. The first 3 days were spent just clearing trash. Previous occupants or vandals had left behind decades of debris. Old furniture, rotting clothes, mysterious metal objects that might have been mining equipment. Rebecca filled a rented dumpster twice over. She worked from sunrise until dark, wearing a respirator mask against the dust and mold, slowly revealing the bones of the house beneath the decay. The structure was actually solid in places, the old-growth timber framing still strong despite decades of neglect. The stone foundation appeared intact. If she could somehow afford to address the roof and floor issues, the house might actually be salvageable. On the fourth day, Rebecca started removing the water-damaged wallpaper in what had been the dining room. The paper came off in large sheets, soggy and disintegrating in her hands. Beneath it was another layer, probably from the 40s based on the pattern. Beneath that was another layer, and another. She counted 7 distinct layers of wallpaper, each one representing a different era of the house's life. As she pulled away the final layer, expecting to find plaster, her hand went through the wall. The plaster had deteriorated completely in this section, revealing the lath strips beneath. Rebecca peered into the gap and saw something unexpected. Between the studs, filling the entire cavity of the wall, were packages wrapped in oilcloth. She carefully widened the hole and pulled out the first package. It was heavier than she expected, about the size of a brick, and tied with twine that crumbled when she touched it. She unwrapped the oilcloth and found herself staring at bundles of currency. The bills were old, that much was immediately clear. Rebecca carefully unfolded one and saw a $50 note with a design she didn't recognize, dated 1929. She sat on the dusty floor, heart pounding, and unwrapped more of the bundle. All $50 bills, all from the late 20s. She pulled another package from the wall. More bills, these were hundreds. Her hands shook as she widened the hole further and discovered that the packages continued down into the wall cavity, stacked carefully between the studs. Over the next hour, Rebecca removed 47 packages from that section of wall alone. She laid them out on the floor, afraid to fully unwrap most of them, terrified that this was somehow illegal or that someone would accuse her of theft. She had found approximately $200,000 in old currency hidden in her wall, and she had no idea what to do about it. She pulled out her phone to call the police, then hesitated. Was this even real money anymore? Could bills from 1929 still be spent? And most importantly, who had hidden this money and why? She began systematically checking the other walls. The dining room yielded nothing more, but when she moved to the living room and started removing wallpaper there, she found another cache. This one contained smaller bills, 20s and 10s, all from the same era. The parlor had more. The bedroom downstairs had packages stuffed not just in the walls but under the floorboards. Rebecca worked through the night, unable to stop, pulling her house apart and finding money in almost every room. By dawn, she had extracted 372 packages in total, laid out across the floor in neat rows. She drove to Athens, the nearest real town, and found the public library when it opened. She spent 6 hours researching, trying to understand what she had found. Currency from 1929 was still legal tender, technically spendable at face value. But old bills, especially in good condition, were worth significantly more to collectors. The bills she had found were in remarkable condition, protected by the oilcloth and the dry interior of the walls. A 1929 $50 bill in excellent condition could be worth several $100s to collectors. Certain serial numbers, printing errors, or rare variations could be worth thousands. Rebecca had found approximately $450,000 in face value. The collector value could be substantially higher. She contacted a currency dealer in Cleveland who specialized in historical paper money. She sent him photographs of several bills, including serial numbers and condition details. His response came within hours, marked urgent. The bills were genuine, he confirmed, and in exceptional condition. Several had rare serial numbers. He asked if she had more and whether she would be interested in selling. When Rebecca told him she had nearly 400 packages, his next email simply read, "We need to meet. This is significant." The dealer, Martin Kowalski, drove to Millfield the following weekend. He was a slight man in his 60s who treated the bills with the reverence of a museum curator, wearing white cotton gloves and examining each note with a magnifying glass. He spent an entire day cataloging what Rebecca had found, cross-referencing serial numbers against databases of known rare variations. When he finished, he looked at Rebecca with an expression somewhere between excitement and disbelief. "Do you understand what you have here?" he asked. "This isn't just a collection of old bills. This is a systematic preservation of pre-depression currency in pristine condition. Whoever hid this money knew exactly what they were doing." He explained that many of the bills were from the period just before the banking crisis of 1929, when wealthy individuals had begun pulling their money out of banks in anticipation of economic collapse. Some people had buried their cash. Others had hidden it in walls, exactly like this. The total collection, Martin estimated, would be worth between $2.8 and $3.2 million to collectors, depending on how it was sold. Some bills should go to auction, where rare serial numbers could fetch premium prices. Others should be sold directly to institutional collectors or museums. The process would take time, perhaps a year or more, but Rebecca was sitting on a fortune that had been hidden in her walls for nearly a century. She spent the next week researching the house's history, trying to understand who had hidden the money. County records showed the house had been built in 1923 for a man named Edmund Garrett, who served as a supervisor at the Black Diamond Mine. Garrett had been wealthy by local standards, earning a substantial salary during the coal boom of the 20s. According to census records, he lived in the house with his wife and 2 daughters until 1932, when the property records became confusing. The house appeared to have been abandoned, then briefly occupied by the mining company, then sold to another family in 1935. Rebecca found the explanation in an old newspaper archive from the Athens Messenger. In October 1929, Edmund Garrett had been one of hundreds of investors who lost everything in the stock market crash. Unlike many who had kept their money in banks or stocks, Garrett had apparently begun converting his assets to cash and hiding them in his walls, perhaps planning to wait out the Depression. But in March 1932, Garrett had been killed in a mine collapse along with 16 other men. His wife, overwhelmed by grief and debt, had apparently moved back to her family in Pennsylvania, abandoning the house and either not knowing about the hidden money or unable to face retrieving it from the walls where her dead husband had concealed it. The house had changed hands several times over the decades, but either no one had done the kind of renovation that would expose the wall cavities, or they had missed the packages in their work. The money had waited, protected by oilcloth and plaster, while the house slowly deteriorated around it. Rebecca worked with Martin over the following year to systematically sell the collection. The most valuable bills went to major auctions in New York and Chicago. Museum-quality pieces were sold to institutional collectors. The bulk of the collection went to dealers who specialized in historical currency. After commissions, authentication fees, and taxes, Rebecca cleared just over $2 million. She could have left Millfield, could have bought a house in Columbus or moved anywhere she wanted. Instead, she used part of the money to properly restore Edmund Garrett's house, hiring contractors who specialized in historical preservation. They rebuilt the structure with careful attention to its original craftsmanship, using period-appropriate materials and techniques. The house became beautiful again, its craftsman details revealed, its rooms filled with light. Rebecca kept teaching, but she moved to a small rural school district 20 minutes from Millfield, where class sizes were smaller and students needed her. She lived in the restored house, walking the same floors Edmund Garrett had walked, looking out windows he had looked through. She set aside money for her future and established a scholarship fund for students from Millfield and surrounding coal towns, kids whose families had stayed when the mines closed and whose opportunities were limited by geography and economics. In the restored dining room, where she had first pulled away wallpaper and discovered bundles of cash, Rebecca hung a framed photograph of Edmund Garrett that she had found in the County Historical Society archives. He looked serious in the photo, wearing the stiff collar and careful expression of men from that era. She thought about him often, imagining him hiding his money in these walls, trying to protect his family from the economic catastrophe he saw coming. He had failed, killed before he could use the fortune he had preserved. But his money had waited, patient and hidden, for someone who needed it just as desperately as his wife must have needed it in 1932. Rebecca had bought a deserted house for $5,000, looking for something affordable, something she could maybe fix up over time. She had found $3 million hidden in the walls, but more than that, she had found a connection to a man who had tried to protect his family from disaster, who had worked in dangerous darkness to provide security, who had died with his fortune concealed and his plans unfulfilled. Edmund Garrett's money had finally found its purpose, 93 years late, in the hands of a teacher who understood what it meant to work hard for little pay, to worry about the future, to hope that careful planning might provide some protection against the uncertainties of life. The house stood solid now, restored and inhabited again, no longer hiding secrets in its walls, but offering shelter to someone who had needed it desperately. The money was gone from its hiding places, but its presence had transformed both the structure and the woman who had accidentally discovered it. Rebecca understood, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, that she hadn't really found Edmund Garrett's money. His money had found her, had waited patiently through decades until exactly the right person would be desperate enough to buy a condemned house in a dying town and curious enough to pull away the layers of wallpaper that concealed his secret. That kind of timing, she thought, couldn't be explained by chance alone. Sometimes the past reaches out to help the present, and the help comes in the form of $50 bills from 1929, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in walls by a man who never imagined his desperate attempt to preserve his family's future would someday rescue a stranger's.